everyone, it's Gabriella from Victoire, and today to continue my series on making Victorian underwear so that I don't have to start the complicated dress I want to wear, I am going to be making the drawers from Simplicity 2890. So if you remember, I actually used this exact pattern to make the chemise in my last video, and today I wanted to try making the drawers from it for the first time. I really recommend this pattern to anyone who's getting started in historical or Victorian costuming, and someone looking for an easy to use but historically accurate 1860s undergarment pattern. So even though this is a commercially available pattern and the sizing can be a little bit iffy because these commercial pattern companies tend to add a lot of ease, the shapes and the instructions are historically accurate. The designer for the pattern, Kay Gnay, and I apologize, I definitely mispronounced that Kay, I'm so sorry. She actually used magazines from the 1860s and pulled the patterns from those magazines to make these patterns. So the drawers actually came from a magazine from 1862 called Bazaar, and the chemise was from Bazaar, but an 1863 edition. So I love that they're historically accurate shapes, historically accurate construction, but all available in one super convenient modern package. So if you're interested in seeing how I made these 1860s drawers, please stay tuned and follow along. I looked through the Metropolitan Museum of Art's digital collections to look for examples of lace that I could attach to my drawers. I found a pair of drawers from 1876 that were decorated with lace that was almost identical to a scrap of lace that I had in my stash, so I decided to copy my drawers based off of the 1876 example. This meant that instead of making 4 tucks like the pattern suggested, I decided to make 8 smaller tucks and to decorate my drawers with embroidery. I think there must be some law of nature wherein any sewing project must have one thing go wrong. So I'm getting that started nice and early with this sewing project. So I found this lace in my stash that was absolutely perfect for this pair of drawers. It looked so close to the museum example that I'm going off of, and I had just one length of it. So I split that length in half and I sewed the 2 halves into a tube. It's also freight checked and stitched like 4 times to make sure it's extra secure. However, this one bit of lace, this length of lace, is just not long enough to go around the leg of the drawers as is in the pattern. I pinned out the inseam of my drawers and I tried them on real quick, and I have determined that there's so much volume in here that even if I were to take out 1.5 inches of the inseam and kind of taper it out of this corner, I would still have plenty of volume left in the drawers in order for these to be functional. I'm drawing a line where the new seam line should be in order for the lace to properly fit around the drawers. This will not be my new cutting line, and this is just my new seam line. So now I'm going to go ahead and mark 5/8 of an inch away from that. First step is going to be sewing the hems of each drawer leg. The pattern piece states that 3/4 of an inch has been allowed for the hem, but I am actually increasing that to 1 inch in order to better match the inspiration pair from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I have just folded up my 1 inch. I'm just going to fold down about 1/8 of an inch. Alright, so I have the legs of my drawers hemmed, and now it's time to start marking the pintucks. This is not the only way to make pintucks, but it's the way that I find works best for me. So first I'm going to lay the fabric wrong side out, and then I'm going to fold the wrong side to the inside because we want our pintuck on the outside of the fabric. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to fold the fabric, stitch along the fold, and then we press out that fold, we have our pintuck. So I actually have a completed leg of the drawers right here to show you what the pintucks look like when they're finished. And I'm actually going to use this as a guide to determine the spacing of my pin tucks. So for our first tuck, we're going to measure up from the hem, and the distance from the edge of the hem to the fold of the tuck is 1.5 inches. I'm going to measure 1.5 inches from the edge of the hem to the fold. And then we're going to press. I have my stitch turned down to a smaller stitch length, as I usually do, and I'm just lining up the edge of the fold with this marking in my presser foot. And there's a mark on the plate of my machine here too, so I know I'm going to be about 1/8 from that marking. I can eyeball this, but if you don't feel comfortable eyeballing it, put a piece of tape on your sewing machine and follow along against the piece of tape. Now I'm going to once again refer to my test leg of the drawers, and I'm going to measure what is the distance between the line of stitching of the pin tuck we just made and the fold of the next pin tuck. And it looks like it's 1/2 inch from that line of stitching to the fold. So I'm going to fold my fabric again. And I'm going to make that fold 1/2 inch wide and press it down. I highly recommend when you're making tucks to do a few test tucks on a scrap of fabric to test out what width and distance between the tucks works best for your project. So I've now completed my 8 rows of tucks on my drawer leg. As you can see from my previously completed drawer leg, I'm going to wait until after the leg is fully finished at the side before I attach my lace and before I do my embroidery as well, because I want the lace and the embroidery to be continuous around the leg. The next step is going to be hemming the crotch openings. Now, these drawers are not sewn together at the crotch seam, which is why they're called split drawers. That's typical for drawers of this time period. Having the crotch area open allows one to use the facilities without having to remove layers of garments. Our pattern instructions tell us to make a 5/8 of an inch hem along the front and back crotch area of both drawer legs. So there are 2 ways to finish off the crotch seam of drawers. There's this way that we're doing right here, which is hemming that edge. And there's also another technique we see in extant garments, which is to use a wide bias facing along this edge. Now, while the pair of drawers from the Metropolitan Museum of Art that I used as inspiration for the decoration of these drawers have that wide bias facing, I wanted to stick to the pattern because after all, I'm testing this pattern. I've never made this pattern's particular pair of drawers before, and I was curious to see how they made up. And I can always make drawers with facing in the future. We're going to assemble our drawer leg by using a flat felt seam. And to get started on that, I'm just matching up very carefully at the bottom of the leg, making sure that the tucks and the hem are matched up. I've stitched both edges together and pressed. We're going to be using a flat felled seam here, and we're going to fell the seam towards the back of the drawers. The first step in doing that is going to be trimming the seam allowance on the back edge of the drawers. So we now have 2 finished legs. And it's time to attach them. So the instructions just have us lap over the left over the right side, and as you can see there's a bit of like a notch in the cloth, which is what indicates to us that we need to line these up. So these are going to be straight across like that, lapping left leg over right leg, and then we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to run a gathering stitch all across the top. The next step is to prepare the waistband. We are going to first stitch the 2 waistband back pieces to the waistband front piece, and repeat that for the identical waistband facing. Next, lay the waistband and facing right sides together, matching the side seams. Even though the pattern doesn't mention it, I'm going to trim the waistband side seams to reduce bulk. Pin the waistband and facing along the sides and top edge. Fold and press up 5/8 of an inch along the bottom of one of the waistband pieces. Then trim that folded edge down to 1/4 of an inch. This folded edge will be whip stitched to the inside of the drawers later and will help completely encase the gathers. I'm going to press the seam that we just sewed. Press any seam after you sew it. It really makes a difference. It's such an easy, quick way to make your garments look better, and I find that it also makes the process of construction easier too. And now we also want to clip the corners of the seam so that when this is folded over, we don't have all this fabric in the corner. I'm just going to go, being careful not to cut into the stitching, just outside it. I'm going to clip like that. And then I'm going to trim the seam allowance. I'm turning the waistband right sides out. It's helpful to have a small pointy tool like a chopstick or dull scissors at hand to help push out the corners. If it's still tricky to get the corners nice and pointy, turn them wrong sides out again and trim some more of the extra seam allowance out. That way there's less fabric bunched up on the inside. Now it's time to attach our drawers to the waistband that we just made. And we're going to start by just connecting the dots. So we have our waistband. We're going to lay that with the unfolded side down against the drawers. And we're going to match up. So for instance, we have this corner of the waistband and we have this point on the drawers, and we're going to match those up. And then we also have this pin marking like the side hip of our drawers, and this is going to match up to the side seam of our waistband. Same on the other side. Finding that corner of the waistband and the corner of the drawers, right sides to right sides. We're only pinning through one thickness of the waistband. So I've gone back to my pattern pieces to try to figure out how they want me to line up the point of the front of my waistband and the front of my drawers. And when I lay over this center front line, for the size I cut out, which is the size 10, yeah, I'm not seeing any of these dots match up, so it should be matching up with these two dots here, which are also the size 10 dots, but it's not. So I'm just going to line up the point of the waistband on the front of the pattern with the place where the two drawers line up in that little space in the front. I have pinned the gathered portion of my drawers to the waistband. And what I've done is in the front, and this is looking from the back of the drawers, where the left part of the drawers laps over the right leg of the drawers, I've marked the center of that piece. And I've aligned it up with the center point on the waistband. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch along here, and then when I get to this point, I'm going to sink the needle into the thread, and I'm going to rotate the thread and continue stitching. I also want to mention that I tried to not have any gathers in that front area because I don't want it to be bulky, where we already have like 3, sometimes 4 layers of fabric where the seams are. I tried to push all the gathers to be on the outside of this overlap. So I just finished stitching the gathering onto my waistband, and one thing that I found helpful was cutting a slit in the point of the waistband and in the drawers. And then I actually went back and I cut a larger notch for the drawers, because when these are turned inside out, they're actually going to be like this with the point over them, so they needed some room without the fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that notch from the waistband material as well. This way, when it folds right side out, there's less fabric bunching up in there. And I'm going to go ahead and trim off the seam allowance of all the gathered up fabric. I press the facing down, being careful to line up the folded edge of the facing with the bottom gathering stitch. I then whip stitch this in place on the back side of the drawers, and then from the front side of the drawers, I top stitch the waistband down. Now that my drawer legs were complete, I lined up the lace tubes with the bottom of the drawers, and I carefully whip stitched the edge of the lace to the edge of the drawer hem. I looked at different embroidery designs online to try to figure out what kind of embroidery was on the drawers from the Met. I determined that it was feather stitch embroidery. I'll link the tutorial that I used down below for making my feather stitch embroidery. Lastly, I made a hand-sewn buttonhole and I sewed on an antique porcelain button. I am so pleased with how these drawers turned out, especially the decoration of tucks, lace, and embroidery at the hem. I just have to say, this is the most ridiculous piece of clothing I have ever made in my life. Add to that list the most unflattering piece of clothing, in that I look pregnant from every direction, even sideways. You can't tell where I start and where I end. Practical, yes. Pretty, maybe from the knee downwards. Otherwise, yeah, I don't think this look is gonna catch on. But I enjoyed making them, and I'm glad that I have my own pair of 1860s drawers now to add to my historical wardrobe. Would I make these again? Probably. I would like to try making them again and using the bias facing along the crotch seam instead of sewing a hem there. And I would like to try some different embellishment styles, because there's extended drawers from the 1860s and 1870s that have really beautiful tucked and insertion appliques in the knee area. So what I tried was comparatively simple to some of the examples that I saw. So I'm interested in seeing what else I can reproduce from that time period. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe to my channel. Happy sewing!